Everyone is watching the Strait of Hormuz. Everyone is watching the back and forth between Washington and Tehran over oil, missiles, and red lines. And I understand why. That story has explosions, ultimatums, and a former president who loves a dramatic headline. But here's what I want you to do right now. I want you to take your eyes off that story for the next few minutes. Because while the entire world has been pointed at Iran, China has been quietly, methodically, and almost invisibly surrounding Taiwan's islands in the South China Sea. Not with missiles, not with fighter jets, with Coast Guard ships, and nobody is covering it. That is the wrong story to be ignoring. Okay, let me tell you what we are going to do today. I am going to show you 4 things. First, I'm going to show you exactly what China has been doing around Taiwan's outlying islands since February 2025 and why the specific tactics they are using matter more than the hardware they are deploying. Second, I am going to introduce you to a framework I am calling the distraction window and explain why China has used this exact playbook before and is almost certainly using it again right now. Third, I am going to show you the regional alliance moves that suggest Taiwan's neighbors have already read China's intentions and are quietly building a legal and military wall in response. And fourth, I am going to give you my honest assessment of where this is heading, what to watch for in the coming days, and what I think the next move looks like. Stay with me through all 4 of these, because by the end of this, you are going to see a story that most analysts are completely missing. Let us start with geography, because geography is destiny in this story, and most people covering this topic do not bother to explain the map properly. Taiwan does not just control the island of Taiwan. It administers several outlying island groups scattered across the South China Sea. 2 of them matter most for what we are discussing today. The first is Pratas Island, also known as Dongsha. It sits at the northern end of the South China Sea. It is an atoll, a national park, and it is lightly defended. Here is the critical detail most people miss. Taiwan's Coast Guard, not its military, is responsible for Pratas. That is not an accident. That is a choice. And it tells you something important about how Taiwan has historically framed this island. It is administered territory, yes, but Taiwan has deliberately kept the military footprint there small. The second island is Itu Aba, also known as Taiping Island. This one sits much deeper in the South China Sea, in the disputed Spratly Islands chain. It has both a military and Coast Guard base. It is Taiwan's only administered feature in the Spratlys, surrounded on all sides by competing claims from China, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. Now here is where the story starts to get uncomfortable. Since February 2025, China's Coast Guard has conducted 39 recorded incursions into Pratas restricted waters. 33 of those happened in 2025. 6 have already happened in 2026. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 39 incursions, not 39 aggressive military actions, not 39 missiles. 39 Coast Guard ship visits to water Taiwan considers its own, and almost none of it made international headlines. On May 23rd of 2026, something happened at Pratas that I want you to pay very close attention to. A 20-hour standoff began between Taiwan's Coast Guard and a Chinese Coast Guard vessel. 20 hours. These 2 ships sat near each other and argued over the radio. Taiwan's Coast Guard described it as an intense verbal confrontation over sovereignty conducted via radio communication. The Chinese vessel broadcast that China had, and I am quoting directly here, sovereignty and jurisdiction over the Pratas. Taiwan's ship broadcast back, and again I am quoting exactly as it was reported, please do not destroy peace. You should return and strive for democracy. That is the correct way to serve your country. Now I want you to hear what is actually happening in that exchange. This is not 2 naval officers having a technical disagreement about maritime boundaries. This is Taiwan's Coast Guard literally asking Chinese personnel to reconsider their political system. That is how fundamental the dispute has become at the operational level. These are not diplomats in Geneva. These are people on boats in restricted water, broadcasting existential arguments to each other across the South China Sea. Then on June 5th and 6th of 2026, Chinese Coast Guard vessel 3501 circled Pratas twice in a continuous 24-hour patrol inside Taiwan's restricted waters. That alone would be significant. But here is the detail that changes the entire story. For the first time ever, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel and a Chinese research vessel coordinated around Pratas simultaneously. Taiwan's Coast Guard confirmed this was the first recorded instance of such coordination and described it explicitly as a possible evolution in Chinese coercive tactics. I want you to understand why that word coordination matters so much. A single Coast Guard ship sailing through restricted water is a provocation. It is irritating, it is aggressive, but it is manageable. A Coast Guard vessel and a research vessel operating together in coordinated fashion is something structurally different. The research vessel provides intelligence. It maps the sea floor. It measures currents and conditions. It establishes a pattern of presence that is not overtly military, but is operationally essential for any future military operation. When you combine persistent Coast Guard presence with simultaneous research vessel operations, you are not just provoking, you are preparing. This is what I am calling the creeping baseline. It is a tactic where you gradually normalize a level of intrusion until the target government, the watching regional powers, and the international community start treating your presence as the new default. The incursion stops being an incident, it becomes background noise, and once it becomes background noise, you can begin the next phase. China has done this before. In the South China Sea, China spent years sending fishing fleets, research vessels, and Coast Guard ships into disputed waters before it began constructing artificial islands on disputed reefs. By the time the construction began, China's presence in those waters was already normalized enough that the world's outrage was somewhat muted. The creeping baseline is not a new Chinese innovation. It is a tested, refined, deliberately executed strategy. And right now, I believe we are watching it be applied to Taiwan's outlying islands. Now let us go to Itu Aba, because what happened there on June 11th of 2026 is arguably even more significant than what happened at Pratas. On that date, 2 Chinese vessels entered the restricted and prohibited waters of Itu Aba. The first was a law enforcement vessel called Sansha Jifa 301. The second was a supply ship called Sansha Tu Hao. Taiwan's Coast Guard administration confirmed this was the first ever such incursion into Itu Aba's waters. Taiwan strongly condemned it as a violation of Taiwan's sovereignty. Ship tracking data showed these 2 vessels had sailed from China's Hainan province, passing near multiple disputed Spratly Island features including both Philippine outposts and Chinese military bases. Think about that route for a moment. These ships did not take some obscure back channel to reach Itu Aba. They sailed a path that took them past China's own military infrastructure in the Spratlys and past Philippine positions. They were visible. The route itself was a message, and the fact that one of the vessels was a supply ship matters enormously. A law enforcement vessel alone could be framed as a sovereignty patrol, a legal exercise of claimed jurisdiction. A supply ship traveling with it tells you this was not just a symbolic passage, it was a logistical operation. Someone was being supplied, or the capability for supply was being demonstrated. Taiwan's Coast Guard called this a violation of sovereignty. And I think that framing, while accurate, actually understates what happened. This was not just a violation, this was China completing what I would call a first Itu Aba crossing, a historic operational threshold. Once you have crossed a line for the first time, crossing it again becomes easier. The second incursion is never as dramatic as the first. The third barely generates a press release. That is the logic of the creeping baseline, and China just applied it to a new location. Now I need to introduce the second major framework for today's analysis. I am calling this one the distraction window. The distraction window is the strategic interval during which a regional power exploits a great power's divided attention to advance territorial or political objectives that would otherwise generate stronger resistance. China has studied American strategic attention the way a chess player studies an opponent's eyes. When America's military, media, and diplomatic bandwidth are consumed by one crisis, China has historically accelerated in a different theater. This is not conspiracy theorizing. It is a documented pattern. China expanded its South China Sea island construction most aggressively during periods when the United States was focused on the Middle East or internal political crises. Right now, the United States is managing an active war involving Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is at the center of global energy calculations. Washington's diplomatic and military resources are stretched. And in that exact environment, China has conducted its first ever coordinated Coast Guard and research vessel operation at Pratas, its first ever incursion into Itu Aba's waters, and a 20-hour sovereignty standoff with Taiwan's Coast Guard. All of this happened within a roughly 3-week window in late May and early June of 2026. I genuinely want you to ask yourself, is that a coincidence? There is also a third layer to this story that almost nobody is connecting. Taiwan's own security establishment has pointed toward it. Taiwan's defense environment includes reporting from June 5th suggesting that China may have provided man-pads, man-portable air defense systems, to Iran, systems that were allegedly used to target U.S. aircraft during the ongoing conflict. China publicly asserts it does not provide military equipment to states engaged in active war. If the reporting is accurate, and I want to be careful here because I am framing this as reported and alleged, not confirmed, then Beijing would be violating both its own stated position and potentially UN sanctions on Iran. But the strategic implication runs deeper than the legal question. If China is providing military equipment to Iran during an active conflict with the United States, it is not simply helping an ally. It is stress testing American military systems in a live-fire environment. Every U.S. aircraft that faces a Chinese-supplied man-pads over Iranian airspace is generating real operational data about American vulnerabilities. That data does not stay in Tehran. I want you to think about who benefits from knowing exactly how American pilots respond to shoulder-fired missile threats in combat conditions. A Taiwanese security official stated publicly that China is attempting to weaken regional alliances and erode the Indo-Pacific security framework while taking advantage of global attention focused on conflicts in Europe and the Middle East. The official described Beijing's Coast Guard deployments as operating under the guise of law enforcement and maritime negotiations. I want you to hold that phrase, under the guise of law enforcement, because it is telling you something important about why China chose Coast Guard ships instead of naval vessels. The moment China sends a People's Liberation Army Navy warship into Pratas waters, the story changes. Every news organization in the world covers it. Washington convenes emergency meetings. Tokyo goes to elevated alert. But a Coast Guard ship? A Coast Guard ship is just doing maritime law enforcement. It is boring. It is procedural. It does not trigger alliance defense commitments. It does not give Taiwan's government the political justification to fire a shot. It is perfectly calibrated to advance a territorial claim while denying the target any clean response option. This is what I call the gray zone architecture. It is the deliberate construction of a coercive campaign using instruments that fall below the threshold of what international law, alliance treaties, and domestic political constraints define as acts of war. The gray zone architecture is not a weakness in China's strategy. It is the strategy. It is designed to leave Taiwan, the United States, Japan, and the Philippines in a permanent state of having been provoked without being able to respond in kind without appearing to be the aggressor. Now let us look at what Taiwan's neighbors are doing, because they have clearly read the strategic situation and they are not waiting for things to get worse before they act. Japan and the Philippines have begun formal negotiations to delimit their overlapping maritime claims east of Taiwan. I want to be precise about what this is. This is not just a bilateral fisheries agreement. This is two countries in the first island chain beginning the legal process of drawing lines that would collectively solidify the maritime framework China would have to challenge in order to execute any serious military operation against Taiwan. China responded to these negotiations by criticizing them and arguing that the waters surrounding Taiwan are Chinese territory. Taiwan responded by stating that any agreement affecting its maritime rights should not be reached without Taiwan's participation. 3 different governments, 3 completely incompatible legal frameworks, and the legal wall is going up anyway. Czechia, a country far from the South China Sea in the heart of Central Europe, purchased approximately $100 million in Taiwanese drones in the first quarter of 2026 alone. That is by far the largest foreign purchase of Taiwanese drones in that period. Now, why does a landlocked Central European country buy $100 million in Taiwanese drones while China is conducting incursions into Taiwan's islands? You could frame it as Czechia investing in defense technology after watching Ukraine. And that is partly true, but it is also a signal. A commercial signal that democracies are choosing to deepen their technological and economic ties with Taiwan precisely because the pressure on Taiwan is increasing. Every foreign government that buys Taiwanese defense technology becomes a stakeholder in Taiwan's continued ability to produce that technology. Czechia's purchase is not just a transaction, it is a quiet vote. Taiwan's own defense industry is moving fast. AIDC, Taiwan's defense aerospace firm, announced it has developed a drone navigation system that does not rely on GPS signals. The explicit reason given was lessons drawn from the war in Ukraine, where GPS jamming has been a decisive tactical tool. Taiwan watched what Russia did to Ukrainian drones with electronic warfare and GPS denial and built a counter before the same problem arrives in the Taiwan Strait. That is serious, disciplined, threat-informed innovation. But here is the troubling counterpoint. Taiwan's special defense budget has had domestic drone development and procurement funds removed. Analysts say this may limit exactly the kind of technological development AIDC just announced. You have an industry moving fast and a budget moving in the opposite direction. That tension is worth watching. Now, I want to give you the honest counter-argument, because if I only tell you the part of the story that confirms my analysis, I am not doing my job. The Steelman case for the other side goes like this. China has been conducting these kinds of gray zone operations in the South China Sea for over a decade. The 39 incursions at Pratas, viewed in isolation, are concerning, but not necessarily escalatory. Coast Guard operations are legally distinct from military operations. China may be establishing a legal and presence-based baseline for future diplomatic negotiations rather than preparing for military action. The fact that China chose Coast Guard ships and research vessels rather than naval assets could be read as deliberate restraint, a signal that Beijing wants to advance its claims without triggering a military confrontation it is not yet ready to manage given its other strategic priorities and domestic economic pressures. The coordination between a Coast Guard vessel and a research vessel could be routine operational evolution rather than the first stage of an invasion rehearsal. That argument is serious. I do not dismiss it. But here is where it breaks down. The timing is too precise. 3 weeks, first coordinated Coast Guard and research vessel operation at Pratas, first ever incursion into Ituaba, all while the United States is managing an active military conflict in the Middle East. If this is routine operational evolution, the scheduling is extraordinarily convenient. And history tells us that when China advances its territorial claims in the South China Sea during American distraction, it does not walk those advances back when American attention returns. The creeping baseline does not reverse. Each threshold that gets crossed becomes the new floor. The KMT dimension adds another layer of complexity I want you to think about carefully. Taiwan's opposition KMT party leader met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2026, the first such meeting since 2016. The KMT leader has previously echoed positions critical of Japanese military modernization and has blamed NATO expansion for Russia's war in Ukraine. Those positions align closely with Beijing's own public rhetoric on both issues. I am not saying that amounts to coordination. I am saying that when you are running a gray zone campaign against Taiwan's outlying islands, having a major opposition political party in Taiwan whose leader has taken positions that closely echo your own narrative is strategically useful. It fragments Taiwan's political response. It gives Beijing a channel for messaging that does not require overt diplomatic communication, and it creates internal debate inside Taiwan at exactly the moment Taiwan needs internal clarity. Okay, here is my verdict. I believe China is executing a deliberate, phased, gray zone architecture campaign against Taiwan's outlying islands using the Iran conflict as a distraction window. The goal in this phase is not military conquest of Pratas or Itoaba. The goal is the normalization of Chinese Coast Guard presence in those waters, the degradation of Taiwan's ability to credibly claim exclusive jurisdiction, the collection of operational intelligence through coordinated research vessel activity, and the political fragmentation of Taiwan's domestic consensus at a moment when Beijing calculates American strategic attention is divided. I could be wrong about the timeline. I could be wrong about how deliberate the coordination with the Iran conflict is, but I genuinely believe the structural logic of what I have described is sound, and I welcome serious pushback in the comments. Here is what I want you to watch in the coming days. Watch whether the coordinated Coast Guard and research vessel pattern at Pratas is repeated. The June 5th to 6th operation was described as the first recorded instance of such coordination. If it happens a second time within the next 30 days, the creeping baseline is confirmed in real time. That is your signal. Watch Taiwan's defense budget negotiations. If the drone development and procurement funds that were removed are not restored in the next budget cycle, Taiwan's technological edge in the one area where it has shown the most innovation, autonomous systems, begins to erode precisely when China is demonstrating the most aggressive intent. Budget decisions are strategy made visible. Watch the Japan-Philippines maritime delimitation negotiations east of Taiwan. If those negotiations produce even a preliminary framework agreement, it means the first island chain is beginning to harden legally in ways that will matter enormously if the situation escalates. China calling those negotiations illegitimate is already a sign Beijing understands exactly what they are designed to do. Here's your homework. Find and read the full public statement Taiwan's security official made about China operating under the guise of law enforcement and maritime negotiations. Read it carefully, because that statement is rare. Taiwan's government does not often speak that directly about what it believes China is doing. When it does, it is because someone in Taipei has decided the public needs to understand the frame. Understanding why that statement was made and why it was made now will tell you a great deal about how Taiwan's own security establishment is reading this moment. And here's the question I want you to take to the comments. If China successfully normalizes its Coast Guard presence around Pratas and Ituaba over the next 12 months, what exactly does Taiwan do next? What options remain? What does the rest of the world owe Taiwan at that point, if anything? I genuinely do not have a clean answer to that question, and I think the honest answer is that nobody does. Tell me what you think. If this kind of analysis matters to you, the kind that goes 3 layers deeper than the headline and gives you frameworks you can actually use to understand the world, then this is your class. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, because the next lecture is already being written and you do not want to arrive late.